Welcome to the Creative Community Podcast presented by Destination Arte. I'm David.
And I'm Mark. We're building a community of people who work together to achieve creative excellence. Today's guest is Western fine artist C. Michael Dudash.
Michael is an award-winning illustrator and a fine artist with a rich career. In our conversation today, he talks about pivotal moments in his journey, as well as some early illustrations that he made that still mean a lot to him.
Michael also speaks about his philosophy of creating art that is both spiritually impactful and technically proficient. This is personally my favorite part of the interview, and I can't wait for you to hear it. Without further ado, here is our interview with C. Michael Dudash.
Well, just born and raised in Minnesota in 1952. Great family. Ultimately became an illustrator in 1977. I always loved art, and it was not a surprise to anybody that I would be a visual artist or maybe a full-time musician. I have a brother who's that, and the arts were very much encouraged in my family. And I'll try to make a long story. I'm getting old, so the story is pretty long, but yeah, that led me into becoming an illustrator for 23 years. My wife's from Vermont. I met her when I was on the road as a musician, and but anyway, in 1977, we had gotten married and I began an illustration career. I got agents in New York City pretty quickly, and I had a long, successful career doing that. And around the year 2000 or 2002, when my kids were basically out of the house and we were empty nesters, I wanted to switch back to doing more of my own work, which led me to doing really what I'm doing now, which is work of the Old West from the 1800s. And I always loved history and loved some of my favorite artists of all time had done, were in the Western market, let's put it that way. And there were a lot of ex-illustrators from the East that went West and had a huge impact on American Western art. So I've been doing that for the last 16, 17 years maybe. And so that's gone very well for me. I'm doing really well. I'm a member of Cowboy Artists of America at this point. And, you know, I don't have any major health problems, thank God. And so I'll be 69 in a couple of weeks, and I'm excited about what I'm doing. I think that some of my best work is still ahead of me. I've got some ideas about actually, shifting a part of what I do in terms of style to maybe try to find something a little bit fresh that's in that could be in the Western art market, to keep me going another 5, 10, 15, 20 years, whatever the good Lord has for me. And I've got friends of mine who are all really in their early 80s who are still healthy and they think straight and are still doing great work. So, you know, we never retire as artists. Most of us don't. I mean, it's not really a career. It's kind of a way of life. And I think that's the arts have always been huge in my life. And music was a big deal too, and still is. That's how I relax. I got several guitars and a mandolin, a piano, and you know, part of my studio was kind of set aside for me to, you know, go do that. I was a worship leader in a church for many years out in Vermont, and I was a member of non-denominational ministry for many years. And my wife and I are sort of in between churches, kind of. Most of the listeners can maybe relate to that, especially if they're older. You know, times change, things change, you move. But that kind of brings you up to date where I'm at. I'm doing work all year long for various shows. I work with several galleries, and you know, Pre to West you mentioned prior to the interview here. That's a big museum show in Oklahoma, and so I've got my whole year planned really already. The paintings that I need to do for certain events and projects. Somewhere in there, I did a lot of teaching back probably in the last between 2000 and 2010, and I haven't really done that now for almost probably 8 or 9 years. And I'd like to teach again. You know, I really enjoyed it. So we will see where all of that goes. Long answer to a short question. Okay.
That's great. That kind of gets a good foundation for our first question for you, which was, you know, looking back at your career so far, like you said, you've got a lot of work ahead of you, but do you have any favorite pieces or maybe pivotal pieces or pieces that you say, you know, this was a turning point for me, or I learned something important with this piece? Do you have anything that you can look back that you can say that about, or do you feel like it's ahead of you, or?
Well, there were, I can think of a few that kind of stand out when I was illustrating. Now, I'll preface this by saying that the way we used to illustrate in America were traditional media, and I've always been an oil painter, a drawer and an oil painter. So when I look back at my career, some of the things I may talk about don't exist anymore, really. They don't exist in terms of the way that the business ran and operated for you to become a freelance artist and get an agent, and everything's gone virtual and digital. I mean, I'm very digitally adept. But in the 90s, when all that started to really influence the industry, I grew along with it. I was self-taught in that area, but it's to this day a part of my creative process. So when I talk about some things I remember, so I started freelancing in 1977 and 78. Remember, I think within a year or two, I got my first TV Guide cover. Probably some of the younger listeners never heard of TV Guide, but it was a big deal. You go every grocery store and every mom and pop and every gas station had a TV Guide on it. So to suddenly walk into somewhere and see a piece of art you did one year, I was probably 27. That was a big deal. And I think that when I got my first movie poster project within a year or two after that, that was also a big deal, pretty exciting. To have you go into a movie theater and there's a big one sheet poster and then, hey, you did the artwork, you know. Yeah. For a kid from a small town in Minnesota, that was a pretty big deal. And I remember when I decided to I was in music full time for about 6-7 years, and I almost went that way for a career, but I went back to art school when I was 25 for one semester. And I was so naive about the entire business. I thought, well, I could just go to, you know, I met my wife from Vermont. I'll just go back east and I'll go to New York and get an agent and I'll start illustrating, which is exactly what I did. But, you know, there were people who pounded the streets for years doing that and never got anywhere. So I was just so naive. I didn't have any fear about, you know, if I really knew what I was getting into, I probably would have been scared to death, but I was too stupid to know otherwise. And so I found an agent right away, and 2 weeks later had a job for the Reader's Digest, which also used to be a big, hugely popular publication. It was, and that was my first job, and I was busy for 23 years. So anyway, so those every time you got worked with a great client early on, everyone was exciting, and it was all a very cool thing to be able to do. So I think finally, I think another pivotal piece was I did the movie poster for Clint Eastwood's Pale Rider movie for Warner Brothers, and that was 1984, I think. And I was in Manhattan at the time. I took a trip down from Vermont, and that poster was plastered all over the subways and on billboards and everywhere, you know. And oddly enough, at the same time, I took a trip to California for some other project, and I'm walking down Sunset Boulevard, and there's a gigantic billboard with my artwork on it, you know, in LA. So looking back, like I said, from a small town in Minnesota, to very quickly reach that level of success in that industry. Well, you and I know where it all came from. I mean, I was saved and met the Lord in 1977 as well, and I was raised Episcopalian in the Anglican Church, and then when I was 13 or 14, I had a stomach ache every Sunday, you know. Didn't want to go to church anymore. So I went on a search, and by the time I was 25 to 26 is when I met the Lord. So it was really simultaneously around the same time my career started as a full-time artist and illustrator. So it was always easy for me to see all those dots get connected via my faith, really. I mean, God gave me the foundation and the desire to trust him. And through all of those years. So So I think that was a big deal, the Clint Eastwood poster. I'd been praying, well, once I got into around 1990, maybe I'd been praying. I said, Lord, are there any other avenues that you want to use my abilities in? And so through a friend of mine, Ron DiCiani, who is very well known and was known and probably still is in the Christian art market, he called me out of the blue, and I started doing work for the Christian marketplace as well as all the secular work I was doing. And that was a real big pivotal kind of moment, I think, for me personally. So in the 90s, I did a lot of work for Dayspring, which was a publishing company out of Arkansas. So, and a few of those paintings became pretty famous and were very successful. One was He Shall Hear My Voice, which we had talked about prior to the recording here. And we did a limited and open edition print, and that instantly sold out. And it was one of these, you may find this interesting. There's a process you go through when you're creating a piece of artwork, step by step by step. That particular painting was a little bit different, and I was praying. I said, Lord, what do you want me to do for the Christian marketplace? I'd been given an open door, and so I had this feeling I wanted to do something on the subject of prayer. And when my wife and I got married, probably at that point, 15, almost 20 years earlier, I'd taken some small little black and white Polaroids of her praying with some nice rim lighting with an open Bible on the floor. And I was going through all my material. Here it is 20 years later, and I saw this little black and white thing, and I said, well, that's a beautiful pose. Maybe I can do something with that. So I pinned it on the wall, and I started painting. I did that painting in one day.
Wow.
And
is that typical?
No. Which is why, that's why I'm telling you the story is that, and I got done with this painting, and I made up all the background, and it was like I wasn't in control. It just happened. And I called my wife in later, and she was knocked over by it, and I sent it to the publisher, and they just loved it. And like I said, it took off, and we sold all these prints. It's been on at least 6 or 8 different book covers around the world. I still get requests to this day for prints or for licensing use of that particular image. So what I wanted to say is that was a moment when I really saw how when something happens in the spirit that makes your faith and your Christian walk real. That was like this. It really was an intervention. I don't really feel like I take any credit for that particular piece. Now that's so rare. Maybe it's happened one other time in my entire career, but that really stands out. I wish it happened all the time. I know other people who do faith-based and Christian work, and they've had the same thing kind of happen to them through a dream. They'll have a vision at night. They wake up and they see it. They saw the painting in their sleep, and they just went and painted it. Yeah, that kind of process can happen, but it's rare. It really is rare. I don't think, like a lot of things, spiritual, we try to figure them out and put them down on a process, and I've found that just doesn't work that way. Anyway, and then I think I was getting burned out on illustration around the year 2000, 2002. I began, just freely painting. I worked with Richard Schmidt, Nancy Guzik. They invited me to paint with them, and he's an incredible, famous American master. And I did some of that, and I just changed the way I worked and got into fine art, became an easel painter. And I've been doing that now for close to 20 years. Which is kind of what I always wanted to do anyway, but being an illustrator allowed me to provide for the family and raise kids and have a steady job really for many years. So, and I think the only thing I'll tell you is I procrastinated and agonized over what I was going to paint as a fine art painter. And I was doing all kinds of different things, landscapes and figurative work and still lifes. And I finally did a Western piece for a gallery out in Scottsdale, Arizona, who I'm still affiliated with, the Legacy Gallery. And I finally succumbed to this notion. They'd been urging me to do something really, truly Western. So I did a Western painting. I posed myself as a cowboy. And he was in a smoky barn atmosphere with a rifle over his shoulder. but I didn't want to use my face. So I used a friend of mine, his father, I'd met him, and he looked just like Sam Elliott, if you know who Sam Elliott is.
Yeah, nice.
He looked like Sam Elliott in his prime. And the guy, I remember when he walked in, I almost fell over. I said, oh, my Lord, you know. And he had traveled to where we were living, and I got to visit with him a bit. And I said, would you mind if I go back to your motel room and take your picture, you know? So I said, he kind of looked at me and laughed a little bit. I said, you and your wife, I just want to sit you in a chair and put a lamp on your face so I can get the right lighting. And he said, oh, fine. So I did, and I put his head on my body. And I sent the painting to the Legacy, and they sold it in one day.
Wow.
And Art of the West, a great magazine in the industry, saw the painting. It was one of their favorite Western paintings of the year. So I once again, I think God's knocking on my head, you know, and saying, well, you need a way to make a living for the now until, you know, you're in the low ground, as they say. And so I finally said, you know what, I could do this because I loved history. You know, I'm a blue collar, small town guy. I did a lot of camping and hunting and fishing when I was a kid, and always loved Westerns, and it you know, it really made a lot of sense. So that's what I've been doing really, like I said, for the last maybe 18 years, 17 years. And here I sit today. I don't know if I would have ever guessed, you know, 30, 40 years ago, this is where I would end up, but here I am. I go on a couple of photo shoots every year, and I really enjoyed getting to know a lot of them. And we sit and talk about these things. And even in their upbringing, it wasn't, you know, called Christian at the time. You know, they're family oriented. The things that their foundation of their cultures in many ways are very similar. And I think as I've traveled a lot, I've done missionary work in Africa. I've been over there several times, particularly in the 90s, and getting to know some people who live there. Same kind of thing. There are these universal truths. We have the benefit, I think, in the Western world of having, you know, we were more advanced in terms of our writing. We had the Bible, we had scriptures, we had various things that we can identify and talk about theologically that you and I are familiar with today. But a lot of places in the world didn't have that, like Native Americans, for example. They had no written word. I mean, they had no writing. They hadn't even invented the wheel when the Western Europeans came to this country. So I find all that kind of fascinating, and how it all, when it comes to art and even music, those universal truths that we can identify in the Ten Commandments or in Christian principles appeal to everybody around the world. So I think that a lot of great art always transcends a specific you know, event or something smaller. The great art and artists, and even in the Western art, same thing. You touch on something that's universal and timeless. And so I try to do that where I can. And occasionally in the Western art, it is very much, okay, that's a Christian thing that's happening. Mm-hmm. But does that all make sense? It's a long, complicated way to talk about it. And I also love, you know, I'm a sucker for, you know, the good guy's wearing a white hat. You know, he takes care of all the bad guys. In the end, he gets the girl, and they ride off into the sunset. Yeah. So you know, that's the little kid in me that I don't think will ever leave. So I love kind of action. It's a good challenge as an artist. I know a lot of collectors love the fact that a lot of my work in the West, you know, has got a lot of emotion and action. You know, running horses and a lot of dust and smoke, and I find that a lot of fun. So I kind of feel like I'm living a life now and painting what I wish I could have done 40 years ago, you know, or 50 years ago. So,
well, speaking of 40, 50 years ago, we wanted to talk about earlier in your career, you were an illustrator, and maybe illustrators that influenced you as you were learning the craft, and maybe illustrators that you knew that were your peers that influenced you, or that you still keep in touch with, or, you know, we just kind of want to know, like, what made the biggest impact on your career and your development as an artist before you made that transition to fine art back when you were an illustrator?
Well, let me see. My family always encouraged me to draw, so I'll lead you up to where the influences came from. My mother had actually gone to art school back in, just after World War II for a while. So she was very talented. My father wanted to be an architect, so he never was able to do it because of circumstances. But I had a lot of genetics and cultural influence that encouraged me as a young boy all the way through, from the time I could stand up and hold a pencil, all the way through the years. And so by the time I was a teenager and certainly got out of high school, my draftsmanship was already well established. And I always had an innate genetic, because I think it came from the genetics, the ability to design things. And I think that's a very important part of creating any good two-dimensional work. So through all those years, whenever I'd see Saturday Evening Post magazine cover or a TV Guide cover or wherever, books, I always loved looking at the illustrations. So a whole variety of illustrators influenced me. My mother also loved the French Impressionists and real more painterly stuff. There were these prints around our house all the time, and I was exposed to all of that. When I went to school, I actually trained as a fine artist for 1 year, and I really wasn't looking specifically at illustration then. I was just looking, I wanted to become a representational painter. And so in 1970, I was in college for a year, and then I quit because I was playing in bands and making music. So I did that for 5 years. When I went back to school, I wanted to learn how to paint representationally. Well, it was hard to find a good art school doing that in 1974, 75, 76. Everything had gone modern. So I was a little bit cast adrift. I didn't know what I was going to do. And I had a job offered to me by McGraw-Hill Publishing Company in Minneapolis, where I was going to art school based on a drawing and a painting in the show. And I quit school and went to work for them for a year and learned the illustration publishing industry very quickly on the job. And it was at that point I said, I really began to look seriously at American illustrators. And I found a whole bunch of guys that I loved their work. There was Bernie Fuchs, there was Bob Heindel, there was Daniel Schwartz. Fred Ottness was doing some amazing complex collage kinds of things with that predated all this multi-layered transparent computer stuff we see all the time now. Yeah. He was doing that all with stat machines and cutouts and amazing stuff. I liked more of what I would call editorial illustrators who were more freely painting. They weren't technical commercial illustrators where they're illustrating, boxes of food and soup cans and all of that. There was a lot of that going on as well. Young people today have no idea what I'm probably talking about. I mean, you live in such a digital world, you can't imagine, what it was like to not have a digital camera in your phone, So I always, once I got into freelancing, I went in the editorial direction a bit. And so all of the guys I was just talking about all influenced me. I would say certainly Bernie Fuchs was a big influence. David Grove was a West Coast guy. I loved his work. I loved what Bob Heindel was doing. I got to know Bob a little bit. We had the same agent ultimately. I went through a couple of different art agents. I went to the Illustrators Workshop when I was just starting out in New York for 3 weeks. It was an opportunity. I got a full scholarship from a half a dozen of these great illustrators. Mark English also is another big influence, incredibly talented man. Several of those guys have all passed on now in recent years. And there were a bunch of these guys that all sort of had a feeling to look. Bart Forbes, I know Bart. He lives down in Dallas, and he's got to be in his, I'm saying, late 70s now. I saw him a couple of years ago. Fabulous artist, great, and they were all wonderful people. They had long, incredible careers, and so they all collectively influenced me. You can see in my work influences here and there. I was fortunate enough because of my drawing ability to land upon something that I guess was pretty identifiable early on, which is important in the arts. And we'll talk about that maybe a little bit more. Trying to come up with a brand, I guess is today what you would call it.
Yeah.
Or a look or something that people can identify what you do and separate you out from the herd a little bit. It can certainly help terms of being successful. So I had, and then I also have Norman Rockwell and Maxwell Parrish and all the guys I discovered who were the golden age illustrators of America in the early 20th century. And even to this day, I urge everybody to go look at all their work. I mean, it doesn't get any better. And it's uniquely American. N.C. Wyeth, Dean Cornwell, Frank Schoonover, the Leyendeckers, the Howard Pyle School that was started in the 1890s. Those guys are unbelievable artists and designers, and the amount of work they could produce on the fly, they were so well trained, is really to this day amazing. And that work now, as an aside, has become pretty valuable in the collectible market. These old paintings, God, when I was young, you'd buy them for nothing. You know,
wow,
it's a shame. I can tell you stories. You know, you could have spent, you know, $50,000 in 1965 on some of that work, and today it'd be worth $5 million. You know. So all of those influences, I think as an art, when you're in the arts or in the music business, they're all kind of the same. You're going to pick up influences all over. And I learned by imitating a lot of them. I mean, I would study their work, and I worked really hard, I just sort of always emulated what I liked, and I ended up in this place pretty early on, almost right away. I started winning awards in my first year as an illustrator. So I had happened upon something that was me, and art directors just began to hire me for that particular look. It served me well. I probably did, I don't know, 1,600 illustrations, I guess, wow, in 23 years. And kind of proud of the fact that I only had 2 that bounced in all those years, you know, that got rejected or
wow,
didn't go all the way to publication. So
that's insane.
Yeah, I have so many questions.
Well, ask away. I'm not going anywhere.
Wow.
I got my water, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I'm leaving here, I got to go out and plow snow. So
yeah, you're like, I'll stay warm. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
I want to know, before we get to question 3.
Yeah, go for it.
Did you said that you went to art, you went to college and you dropped out, you played music. Were you drawing all the time as a younger child, and as you were still a musician? Were you doing music and then drawing for fun? Or did you just say, I'm going to be an illustrator, and then every ounce of your energy went into it? Because to have only 2 ever be rejected means that you put in the work at some time. You're not just right. Or maybe you are the Mozart of fine art. I don't know. But you know, how much time did you put in before you hit that point where you're like, okay, now I'm employed by McGraw-Hill because of all this work?
Well, you know, I think that you know, you did all the normal stuff growing up when you're young and you're drawing, and as I noted, I did all the art stuff you can do in elementary school and junior high and high school, and you're doing all kinds of things. And one of the things you always practice is drawing realistically or representationally. That's sort of the foundation. You know, I tried some slightly different things. I did a little bit of painting in high school, but not much. So when I got out, I just wanted to go to art. I just wanted to go major in art. I went to Macalester College in St. Paul. I grew up in Minnesota, as I said. And it was just a 4-year liberal arts school, but I took all the classes I could in the fine art department. So I did some bronze casting and a lot of life drawing.
Okay.
It was my first exposure. And I would always stay after. There were a couple of different classes. And I'd stay for my class in life drawing, and I'd ask the instructor, hey, you've got an advanced class coming in. Do you mind if I stay? And he'd say, sure. So, you know, instead of me doing it for an hour and a half, 2 hours, I do it for 4 hours.
Yeah. Wow.
So I was really motivated to want to get better. And I took a couple of painting classes, which for the first time I really, you know, got my brush wet with oil and experimented. And so I was interested in learning how to paint, you know, realistically, even though it was in a fine art venue. There was no commercial aspect to it. So, but I was, at that time, that was my focus, but I was also on the weekends playing in a band, you know, so I was really torn, very much so actually, which way to go in my life. So, but I decided I wanted to quit school and just do the music thing full time and see what would happen. So I while I did that for the next, say, 5 years full time, you know, I did pretty well at it. Got to the point I was doing some studio work in several different bands, and you know, I was doing fine. And on the side, then, as you were saying, I was always drawing and sketching and doodling. And somewhere in there, I think I took just kind of a drawing art class in Mankato, where I grew up, Mankato, Minnesota, at the local college, while I was playing in music, and I got some drawings from that era. But I kept my hand in it. And so after being in the music business for 5 or 6 years, I just said, you know, this is a heck of a way to try to make a living. And I did want to have a family someday. And the music business is really tough. I mean, really, really tough. And the other part is you don't really have a lot of control over your own career in a lot of ways. You're dealing with bands and other people and all kinds of in the pipeline. And I knew as an artist, I was going to be much more in control of my own work ethic and my hours and what I wanted to do. It made sense. So I decided to go back to school in art. And I went to the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. So I got in for 1 semester. And here I am. I'm already 25. And so I'm there with a lot of 18 and 19-year-old kids who have no idea what they're doing. So I'm a little bit older, and I'm trying to figure out what I wanted to do. So I took a graphic design class. I did some more drawing and actually some more painting. I took an abstract painting class, you know, and I was getting involved in that. But I also was doing representational stuff. So here I am still practicing my craft. And at this point, I flipped. So now my art was the focus. Music was going to become a lifelong hobby. Okay. And that's where I'm still at today. So I made that choice, which, to be honest, was very difficult for me because I sure love music, and still to this day, and I probably would have done all right in the music business, you know. But so I had an oil painting and a drawing of a man in an art show, student art show, and I got a phone call from an art director from, like I said, McGraw-Hill, and she said, we have an opening for a staff illustrator in 3 or 4 months, and you're going to put together a couple of magazines. So I said, well, I don't know anything about the mechanical end of back then. You're using T-squares and ruby lith and waxers with your type and all this technical stuff. And she said, well, we want to hire you to maybe do illustration in 2 different magazines, and we'll teach you all the other stuff. So I made a decision to leave school again because I was broke and go take a job. So I did that. And I learned on the fly all the mechanical stuff of the publishing industry. So pretty quickly. One other guy and myself, we would put together 2 entire magazines every month. You know, and we're doing all this manually. You know, there's nothing digital. I mean, what was a computer? You know, I mean, They didn't exist. So, and I was doing a lot of overtime freelance stuff at home. I was doing illustrations on the nights and weekends to put in the magazines to get overtime. So that was my introduction to that. And as I said, I became very familiar with all these other great American illustrators that were currently working, you know. Yeah. And I made a conscious decision. Okay, I'm going to become an illustrator. I'm going to do, that's what I'm going to do. And I just got married and one thing led to another, and that was it. So there was this process. And I think where we're going to end up with in the end of our conversation is at some point, if I remember your questions regarding, I think I mentioned to you life values, or what makes successful, or how this transition that I went through. Yeah. And I think this is maybe a good place to talk about that. Thank God I had a family and a father and a mother. We were middle class or lower middle class. He was a carpenter, and we in Minnesota, and I never had an allowance. And from the time I can remember, I was earning my own money, mowing lawns and babysitting and shoveling walks and doing whatever. They gave our whole family quite a work ethic. You know, there was no social backup. There was no welfare. There was no, if you wanted something in your life, you had to get up and go out and figure out a way to earn it. You know, I sold Christmas cards door to door to get a bicycle and everything, you know, delivered newspapers. I mean, all of this stuff. So by the time you're 15, 16 years old, you've had several jobs. You've been making your own money for as long as you can remember. And even if you've got grace with a lot of talent or gifts or anointings, as people sometimes say, it's just going to lay there idle on the shelf unless you've got these other skills and these other this other worldview that's going to make you get out of your comfort chair and go out and do it. And that has served me so well all of my entire life. Just work hard, don't give up, perseverance, self-reliance, responsibility, all of those kinds of things that sound really corny when you're young and nobody wants to really hear about. They're just as valuable in any of the arts as anything else. I've knew some very incredibly talented people in my younger years, but they were lacking a lot of that. So 20 years later, they're, pushing a broom in a high school, and there's nothing wrong with that. But they never were able to take maybe their amazing abilities and do something with them. So, and I don't really feel like I take credit for that, because I wasn't even aware of this at the time. It's just the way you lived, right. You just, if you want to learn how to play an instrument, you spend hours and hours and hours in your bedroom or the basement or just practice until your hands bleed. And I think that's the same thing in art. There were a lot of times when I was illustrating, I'd have maybe 4 or 5 days to do an illustration. I'd be in it 2.5 days, and it was going nowhere, and I had to make a decision. Okay, I'm going to start all over. So I know what that means. For 48 hours, I'm not going to get a lick of sleep, and the food's going to get sent under the door, into the studio. And you just work really, really, really hard to make it right and to make it the best you can. And that's just always been something inside of me and a lot of people. I mean, that's, but I think that's incredibly important for young people to know. Nothing's free in this world. And, we live in a Western country, the richest country that's probably ever existed. And a lot of stuff just falls into your lap, but it's a mistake to rely on that. I think it's because it comes and goes really quick, and life is hard. And the old saying is, you can't control the wind, but you can adjust your sail, that kind of stuff. I mean, all of these life lessons that apply to whatever occupation or whatever dream you have, it's not going to happen unless you make it happen, in a sense, And once I became a Christian and started going to Bible studies and really learned the Word of God and learned these eternal truths, it all started to make sense to me. I was just living on emotion and instinct until I was 30 years old or whatever, and did a lot of stupid things. And God saved my life on more than one occasion, and I'm serious about that. There were at least 3 or 4 times I could have just as easily been dead as alive. And suddenly I, got married, started having kids, began to figure the world out. Now years later, I'm able to articulate it when I teach. Right. And now I can say, when I was maybe your age at 20 or 25 years old, I wouldn't have known how to talk about it really. But today I can now and put the pieces together, and that have served me well in my life. I mean, I still work. I still work my butt off. Last year I did a 20 painting solo show that was in March, early March. And I had 20 major works in 6 months, and I was just, put 60 hours a week in, easy, So, and I think the other thing for me is, if you find something, the old saying, if you find something you love to do, you never go to work a day in your life. That's only partly true, because it is work. Yeah. And there's some days I crawl out to the studio, and, oh Lord, but it feels like work. But in the end, I get up every day and I'm inspired to be creative, and I got to make a living at it, and I'm able to help my kids when they need it and that kind of thing. But I still work hard. And thank God, that just came from my parents, and it breaks my heart to see so many young people or so many families or so many situations where folks just don't have that foundation, no fault of their own. It really breaks your heart, doesn't it? I mean, I'm sure you're aware of that as well. Yeah. God, when I married my wife, and I won't get into all the details, but she came from a background that it's amazing that she and her siblings, can even think straight, the tough situation they grew up in. And they persevered and survived despite that. But so I try to pass it on to my kids. Mm-hmm. I try to, when people call or young people call, or I try to be always helpful. I had a lot of helping hands to me growing up and in my career. And I always appreciate that so much from folks who took the time to help me out and answer questions. And so I think we owe that to the world and owe that to those who come behind us. Pass on as much wisdom as we can. Hey, that's why I'm sitting here rambling on with you guys.
We're so grateful. Wow. Yeah. That's great.
Thank you so much for that piece of advice. I want to like clip that audio and like put it on YouTube just as like Michael Dudash motivational speech, you know, to listen to while you work. That's amazing. We had kind of a more specific question from one of our listeners. He's an art teacher, and he was wondering about where you learned and how did you develop your oil wash technique. You do this beautiful technique that's very luminant. How do you say that?
Well, there's a certain luminosity.
Yeah, that's what word I'm looking for.
Well, or I won't call it illuminating, but it's
I couldn't.
Yeah.
But well, we were wondering how
that's not. The interesting thing is I always loved to draw, and my drawing abilities, like I said, when I was in school, were already well established. And when I started studying the older illustrators, I happened upon Maxwell Parrish, who's you all owe it to yourselves to look at his work. And he had taken the concept of glazing, which is thin, transparent layers of paint, to a pretty high level. And I did what he did. Same thing with him. When he was young, you know, he could do a lot of pen and ink and black and white stuff. And then what he started doing is glazing transparent paint over his drawings. It's sort of like tinting. Okay. You know, it's sort of like if you did a drawing and spray fixed it and it's all fixed. And then you took a sheet of like a transparent cellophane that's got a color. And you lay it on the drawing. You can see the drawing, but there's color now. Yeah. You know, infusing the whole thing is pretty logical. That's all glazing really is. And traditionally, throughout our history, it was a real common thing that oil painters did for centuries. They've been doing. It's nothing new about it. The old way of doing it is you'd each layer would have a layer of varnish, Damar varnish or something that would dry. You'd have to let it thoroughly dry. Do a thin layer of oil paint, let that dry. Another layer of varnish, and you would gradually build up colors and build up values on top of the underlying layer. So Parrish was doing that. And so I started doing it. I remember the first time I ever did it, I was in art school and I experimented. It was a drawing of an old man. And I actually drew it on a piece of canvas that was gessoed. It was a canvas board. And so I spray fixed it. Krylon workable fixative is what I've always kind of used. And then when that was dry, I just took thinned out oil paint. You know, you can take it right out of the tube. And I didn't bother with varnish. I just thinned it out, and with soft brushes or, you know, you spread it over the drawing. And while it's still wet, you can remove it. I mean, you can just, you know, depending upon the substrate, what's underneath it. Some material is more absorbent than others. So that's really how I started illustrating. I mean, and then I would do a couple of layers, or you know, I would add more paint. So by the time I started freelancing, that's what I was mostly doing. Well, then I discovered Bernie Fuchs was really the one who really made this very popular, where he would sort of forego the drawing and everything, and he would scrub down sort of medium to darker values of paint, and then on there it's like an acrylic gessoed canvas, so you could take it off pretty easily. And he would go along with various brushes or your finger or paper towel or paint thinner, and you could remove the paint. And I know that he would also supplement it sometimes with semi-opaque paint, or he'd go back on top and use more opaque paint to finish off a painting. Sometimes he'd use Dr. Martin's dyes or a water-based thing in bright color areas. He'd put that down first, glaze over with oil paint. You can do dry medium or water-based mediums underneath, and then when that dries, you can do oil on top. You don't go the other way around. You can't do acrylic on top of oil, let's say. You know, yeah, you need to understand the mechanics of that, but it's pretty simple. And so when I saw his work, I loved everything about his work. Why not? He's incredible, world-class Hall of Famer illustrator. And I loved his design sense. And, you know, just, so his approach influenced me, but I was just much tighter than what he was doing. I had a different way of kind of doing it and looking at it. And I mentioned David Grove earlier. He was doing it on the West Coast with gouache,
Okay.
which is a water base. And that dissolves like poster paint sort of, and it'll dissolve with just water. And several illustrators, you know, all got into doing that, giving it kind of a similar look. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think there are various ways of using thin, transparent paint and removing it, right, almost painting negatively as opposed to positively. Now, what happened is, as I was in the business longer, and I'd seen a bunch of Bernie's originals and other people doing this, and I wanted to do something more with the original, so that the original paintings had more impact, with maybe a little more paint. Maybe were a little, they weren't so watercolor-like, you know. So I started eventually figuring out a way to do get the same look with more opaque paint. So I'd still put down more the darker transparent colors, sometimes a little bit of semi-opaque paint. And what I was doing, I was began mixing opaque paint and trying to figure out how to process to apply the paint and give you the same kind of look, which I eventually was able to do. I won't get into all the technical stuff. With a little bit of practice, people can sort of figure that out. And I'm glad I did that, because by the time I got out of illustration, I was more of a bravura, direct painter, you know, where you're just mixing colors on the palette and just applying them directly. But I will start out a painting many times with a block in a very transparent paint.
Okay.
And push it around and scrub it off, and it dries very quickly that way if you don't have any white with it, or I'll use liquid to dry it a little bit quicker. And so that by the next day or the end of the day, I'm ready to go with more opaque paint. And so I work dark to light, light to dark. I go back. There's no rhyme or reason today. I just kind of go wherever I want to go with it to achieve the result I want. But that look that the person asking the question, it's a very legitimate question. I've answered it a million times over the years from people. How do you do that? I've demonstrated a lot when I would do oil painting. People always want to know how I do it. And then I do it that way real quick. And I'd say, here's how I do it today. And I'd show them how I do with solid paint. And which I find more satisfying and actually more flexible. It's easier to control. So long answer to a short question, right?
That's great.
When I would teach, and I think this is very interesting, you know, I'm always I was trying to figure out as I grew older, how to articulate when I would teach about art. I teach oil painting, but the whole background and foundation is what's going on in your mind and your heart. You know, the foundation of anything we do in life. So I remember came from a Bible teaching many years ago when I heard a rough teaching of Christ on the cross, good thief, bad thief. And this good versus evil, light and dark, you know, there's this sort of dichotomy in the world, right? I mean, that we live through. And there's the natural and there's the spiritual, right? We're all pretty much aware of that, no matter what your philosophy is or where you come from. You know, if you take a minute, there's a spirit world of some kind. There's eternity. Where did we come from? All of those questions. There's love, there's emotion, there's anger, these unseen things. Give me a pound of love. Well, how do you do that? All those things. And there's the natural, which are the sciences, and the natural world, which we can quantify and measure. And we live in both, do we not? You know, our feet are on the earth and our heads in the heavens, so to speak. So even when I was teaching a class that had nothing to do with faith or philosophy or any, and I have done Christian workshops, but when they're quote secular, I wanted to always talk about this because as an artist, you're always dealing with two things, the emotional, spiritual side of things. And then there's always the technical side. Now we can teach people the technical side. You know, you do this, this, and this, and this will happen. You know, you sharpen a pencil, it's going to make a thinner line, you know, or we can teach you color. We can teach you, those things are very teachable and can be done in a logical step-by-step progression. The other side is much more difficult to quantify, and what makes us human and what makes us individuals. And I would oftentimes use a music analogy because it's very simple right off the bat, is that you could take a Bob Dylan who, knew half a dozen guitar chords, played a little harmonica, but he had something to say, and he could communicate through his very simple songs and his words, which are really poetry. And he changed the music industry. He changed the direction for millions and millions of people with a way of using his very simple skills to change the music industry. And I think that you can also conversely find a classical or a jazz player or a pianist who are technically just unbelievable. There's no limitation to their technical ability, what they can do. You're amazed. You are so amazed. Mm-hmm. Well, they influence people from maybe another viewpoint. And that's sort of the way I always felt about looking at music, is that, you got to say somebody like Dylan way over here, and you got a Van Cliburn, or you got a classical player or a Miles Davis or somebody way over here. And yet they're both having this incredible influence on the world. And it's like that with art, very, very much so. I think that, so when I'm in the class, I'd say, I can teach you this, but I said, I'm just as interested in what you have to say, what you're, and what, having all that ability, but nothing to express doesn't do anybody any good, And I think that you and I, when you look, if you're honest, you look in the mirror, you sort of have a propensity to be one way or the other. Some people are very technically oriented, and some people are emotionally and spiritually oriented. And we all have a mix. So I think that a little self-examination will show you where your weaknesses are, your strengths are. And I think when you come in the middle, this goes back to the biblical teaching, where really God himself sits in the middle. The closer you come to this great place, that's where I almost think miracles or wonderful things happen. This wonderful combination of technical ability with something beautiful to say, where you can influence people emotionally. Most people buy my art, I believe, because it's an emotional response. Now, they might say, well, no, it's got a dog in it, or I love the look of that horse, or I always like the history, or, but that's only going to take you so far. There has to be an emotional connection. And that's what's so beautiful about art. There's something in scripture that says when you play music, you're really praying twice at the same time. There's this mystery that's happening in the arts. And I know for a fact it's a combination of these things I'm talking about. And, and I get this a lot. There's a guy named Matt Tommy who has a wonderful ministry for many years called I'm going to have a senior moment here, the worship studio. He's out of the Carolinas too. North Carolina lives in. Have you heard of Matt Tommy?
No, you mentioned to me the last time, and I forgot his name after we hung up, so I was going to look him up.
Yeah, well, all your viewers, check him out. He's a great guy. He's a great teacher. And now I'm trying to think. Oh, yeah. Well, I was invited to go down, probably 10, 15 years ago to teach. I did it a couple of years at this big annual event he has. And he said to me, he said, look, we have a lot of wonderful people who want to be artists, and they're Christians, and they, blah, 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 blah. He said, but their art ability is just awful. He said, I can't draw a straight line with a ruler or a circle with a compass. So those are my words, not Matt's. He's way too generous to say something like that, but I'm not. So he wanted me to come and try to convince them that it's okay to just, express yourself, but that's like a 6-year-old with finger paint, And so they're maybe where they want to be in the spirit, but they're nowhere on the other side. So nobody's going to listen to you or look at your work or whatever unless there's a certain amount of expertise or technical ability that makes it work. It's like that in the movie industry. Why is it that so many Christian movies over the years, have been, let's be generous and say not worth watching in many ways. The message is what you want. The message is incredible, but nobody's going to take the time and be emotionally respond to it because it just maybe wasn't done that well. There's no budget. Right. Or maybe the acting or the writing's not that great, or whatever. So I'm a firm believer that if you're going to do something in life, do it the best excellence you can on both sides. And when I look at the Western art market today, it's the same thing. You know, there's some incredible technical painters, unbelievable. And there's, you know, and for me, sometimes it leaves me a little bit dry, you know, because all I do is focus on, gee, you know, wow, somebody took the time to do that, 500 hours, you know, paint, you know, that I would have done in 5, you know. And that's not a slam. I mean, I really, honest to God, I appreciate it. I think it's incredible. There's a place for that in the arts for sure. And a lot of people respond to that, you know. And so for me, it's much more of a mix of the other. I try to be technically adept and good at what I do, but not lose the spiritual, emotional side, and always have some area for accidents or some atmosphere or and feel free to move away from my photo reference, let's say, or painting exactly what I see in front of me, you know, interpret it. I allow my spirit, my emotions, in essence, God's spirit, to reinterpret what I'm looking at and come up with something maybe fresh and have a bit of mystery to it that I can't control. So I think that all goes, I think that's so important when we talk about the arts. So I think one of the questions was, how did I go from illustrator to fine art? I think as a fine artist, you have much more freedom to attempt, to allow that to flow freely. Yeah. It's a bit risky. When you're an illustrator, you pretty much know what the client wants and you know how to get there, and you're going to be successful if you can technically reach this point. You know, you're being hired to solve somebody else's problem or sell a product, or you got a pretty clear path ahead of you. In a lot of ways, editorial illustration is a bit freer, which is why I liked it. But when you get into the arts, I just think to examine your own heart, your own technical abilities, what you want to say ultimately, and where you want to go with your art, and you'll find your own place. You'll find your own unique combination of these things that will apply to the time and the culture and the year you live in. And that's what's really exciting to me about the art. You know, I'm very eclectic in my taste. I like everything that's done. I get a sense if it's done well, with a wonderful purpose and intention. And it's what makes me still get up every day and be excited about the opportunities I have to do what I do. So there's another little sort of commentary you can add to your my philosophical dribble.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Michael, if you would just tell people maybe your website or your Instagram, just so that we have it on, so I could put it at the end, but just tell people where they can find your work. Well,
it's www.cmdudash.com.
Okay.
So it's all run together, lowercase, cmdudash.com. So that really is the best place. I mean, I do a little bit of Facebook, not much, a little bit of Instagram. I just don't take the time. I need to probably have somebody come in here who I can say, okay, for the next 3 hours, just twice a week, load up all this stuff. I just don't take the time to do it that much. I probably should. But anyway, I do have I haven't been on Instagram now in months. I can't even remember what my, I guess, tagline or whatever you call it.
We'll put it in our outro.
Yeah, if you just go on Instagram, punch in my name, type Michael Dudash, you'll find it. And the website's pretty extensive, but I'm pretty good about that. So you can always look at available work.
Okay.
And easy to navigate.
We are so grateful to Michael for sharing his time, wisdom, and knowledge with us. You can find him at cmdudash.com or cmdudash on Instagram.
As always, subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Spreaker, all of those platforms if you want to hear more interviews like this one. And leave us a review. It lets the algorithm know you liked it and helps them give that to more people like you. And speaking of people like you, if you know a friend that would benefit from this interview, feel free to share this episode with them so they can listen to what Michael had to say.
Yeah. Connect with us on Facebook and Instagram at Destination Arete, A-R-E-T-E, for more interviews like this one, community activities, and upcoming Arete projects. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another interview. See you then.